Midnight. The blizzard is howling, breath freezing to smoke, when Alice slams on her brakes. A pair of wild bobcats block the lonely mountain road, one wounded, both desperate. Instead of turning away, she steps out, offering a trembling hand to the untamed night. That act of courage doesn't just save two wild lives. It sparks a storm of suspicion, hope, and unlikely community. What follows will test Alice's heart, threaten everything she loves, and, in the end, reveal how trust and kindness can heal not just wounds, but a whole town. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear, have you ever welcomed something wild or unexpected into your life? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe small acts of courage can change the world, please like, subscribe, and join our circle of wild-hearted friends. It's the kind of cold that creeps into the marrow, turning breath to smoke and hands to stone. Midnight in the mountains should have been a silent, empty hour. The world hushed under a blanket of hard-packed ice and moon-glazed snow. But as Alice Grant gripped the wheel of her battered Subaru, headlights slicing through the swirling mist, she could feel something pulsing in the dark woods. A wildness, old and restless, that had nothing to do with her or the road beneath her tires. She was used to loneliness, these empty stretches between the tiny mountain town and her weathered log cabin perched deep in the pines. Since Henry passed, Alice had found a certain comfort in the rhythm of routines. Market runs before dawn, radio crackling with old tunes, her old dog Charlie waiting faithfully by the porch. But this night felt different. The wind carried a biting edge, sharp with the promise of snow, and Alice's thoughts kept drifting, memories of Henry's laugh, the warmth of a house filled with voices, the emptiness that followed. She rounded a narrow curve, eyes fixed on the frost-glittered road ahead, when a sudden movement snapped her attention to the left. Her heart leapt into her throat, a dark shape darting from the underbrush, swift and low. She slammed the brakes, tires skidding, the world narrowing to the cold white beams of her headlights. Out of the shadows, two figures emerged. Not deer, not foxes, something else. Wild, muscular, one slightly smaller, coat bristling, moving with a limping gait. The other, larger, bolder, standing protectively in front. Bobcats. Alice's first instinct was fear. Fear for the animals, fear for herself. But something in their stance rooted her to the spot. The cats didn't bolt. The bigger one squared its shoulders, yellow eyes catching the light. Not in challenge, but in a kind of fierce, desperate courage. The smaller, limping one hovered just behind, gaze never leaving Alice's face. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the night holding its breath. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the beams, swirling around the silent tableau. Alice's heart hammered in her chest. She could see the injury now, a fresh cut on the limping cat's back leg, blood stark against the pale fur of its belly. The larger bobcat, battle-scarred, its ear nicked, fur matted, stood impossibly still, as if waiting for Alice to decide what would happen next. She killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. Charlie whined from the back seat, sensing the tension. Alice stared, torn between wonder and terror. She'd heard stories, old mountain tales, of wild cats stalking livestock, even shadowing lost hikers. But these two didn't move like predators. They stood with a wary, watchful dignity, eyes never leaving hers, as if testing her for something deeper than fear. The cold seeped in, burning her cheeks. Alice hesitated, then slowly rolled down her window, trying to breathe through the racing panic in her chest. "Go on now," she called gently, voice shaking. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." As if understanding, the limping cat took a cautious step forward, and then another. The larger one pressed closer, almost brushing against its companion's side, gaze shifting protectively between Alice and the road behind. Then, with a sudden liquid grace, both cats turned, not to flee, but to walk purposefully across the ice and disappear into the tangle of pines on the far side. Alice stared after them, the night swallowing their shapes. For a heartbeat, she thought it was over. But just as she reached for the ignition, she heard it. A sharp, plaintive cry from the darkness. Not a scream of pain, but a call, urgent, insistent, and unmistakably directed at her. She froze. Another movement, deeper in the woods. The smaller bobcat appeared again at the edge of the trees, staring back at Alice. In its eyes, shimmering with the reflected light, there was no accusation, only an unspoken plea. The cat limped, struggled, then sat, refusing to disappear. 1,000 thoughts tumbled through Alice's mind. Should she drive on, forget what she'd seen, call animal control in the morning? Or should she get out, step into that freezing darkness, risk whatever waited beyond the warm, safe bubble of her car? A deeper intuition tugged at her, something Henry used to call mountain sense. The feeling you get when you know the land is asking for your help. She shut her eyes, listened to her own ragged breath, then grabbed the old wool blanket from the passenger seat. Stepping out, boots crunching on the icy gravel, she walked toward the trees. Every instinct screamed caution, but the bobcats held their ground. As Alice approached, the larger cat did not retreat. Instead, it moved aside, leaving space for her beside the injured one. Alice knelt, blanket outstretched. The limping cat's ears flicked nervously, but it didn't run. Instead, it let out a soft, guttural sound, a mixture of warning and trust. Alice's gloved hand shook as she reached out, but she held steady, heart thundering. The night seemed to hold its breath with her. "You need help, don't you?" she whispered. The cat didn't answer, but its golden eyes never wavered. As Alice gently wrapped the blanket around the smaller bobcat, the larger one sat nearby, a silent sentinel. Charlie's bark echoed from the car, but he didn't lunge. He simply watched, as if understanding this was a moment beyond words. In that frozen midnight, with wildness and fear dancing together, Alice felt something shift inside her, a thin, bright thread of courage binding her to these strange new guardians. She knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that this night was not the end of her loneliness. It was the beginning of something wild, mysterious, and deeply alive. And as she carried the injured bobcat toward her car, the other falling into step behind her, Alice realized she was not just bringing home a story. She was accepting an invitation into a world where courage and wonder still walked on 4 paws, silent and watching, just beyond the edges of ordinary life. Long before the first slant of dawn crept across the mountaintops, Alice pulled into her drive, the car's headlights splashing pale gold over the snow-dusted porch. Her hands trembled as she turned off the ignition, the weight of what she'd just done settling on her shoulders. Behind her, the 2 bobcats, one swaddled awkwardly in her wool blanket, the other prowling the shadows, were silent, watchful, and impossibly calm, as if the night itself had folded them in its secrets. Charlie, her faithful old shepherd mix, stood at the front door, tail wagging anxiously, barking a greeting muffled by the thick door. Alice fumbled for her keys, nerves jangling with the wild unreality of the moment. Just as she reached the steps, she heard a rustle behind her. The larger bobcat, bolder and battered, was right at her heels. The smaller one, now free of the blanket, limped delicately but kept pace, eyes gleaming with strange intent. She opened the door, the warmth of the cabin spilling out, and braced herself for chaos. But what happened next startled her more than any wild chase on the road. The bobcats didn't bolt, didn't snarl, didn't even hesitate. Instead, they paused at the threshold, as if waiting for permission. For a heartbeat, Alice hesitated, half expecting them to tear through the kitchen or leap at Charlie. But the look they gave her was so direct, so filled with something like trust, that she stepped aside. "Come on then," she whispered, half to herself. "Let's see what you're after." The cats moved past her with a fluid grace, their paws silent on the old wooden floorboards. Charlie's hackles bristled, but he didn't growl. Instead, he circled them warily, nose twitching, eyes wide with the keen alertness of a dog who knows that tonight, the rules are different. The larger bobcat stopped in front of the hearth and astonishingly sat down, tail curled around its paws, gaze sweeping the room as if inspecting its new territory. The limping one limped to the worn rug near Alice's favorite chair and crouched, wary but strangely at home. Alice barely had time to process this surreal scene when a faint scratching noise drew her attention. She spun, heart in her mouth, but saw only the two bobcats at the door, each with something clamped gently in their jaws. A field mouse, limp but untouched, and a small rabbit still warm. They laid their gifts on the doormat, then sat back, eyes fixed on Alice and Charlie. She stared, stunned. Gifts? What kind of wild animals brought offerings? Her mind raced through all the wildlife documentaries she'd ever watched, all the stories Henry used to tell about the uncanny intelligence of wild things. But nothing had prepared her for this. The bobcats didn't move, didn't demand. They simply waited, tails flicking, as if presenting tribute to a queen or seeking the approval of a wary guardian. Charlie sniffed the mouse, then looked up at Alice for direction. She knelt, hands trembling, and gently stroked his head. "It's all right, boy. They're not here to hurt us." Still, unease prickled along her skin. This was no ordinary night, and these were no ordinary visitors. Alice moved to the window, peering out at the falling snow, mind whirring with questions. Should she call animal control? The sheriff? The local wildlife office? She reached for her phone but stopped, the device heavy in her hand. Something in the bobcat's eyes, especially the battered, older one, pleaded for a chance. Not mercy, exactly, but understanding. It was a look she recognized from her own reflection in the mirror on the loneliest mornings. Instead of calling anyone, Alice turned back to the fireplace and stoked the embers, coaxing the flames to life. The larger bobcat watched every movement with an almost human intensity, while the limping one inched closer to the warmth. Charlie settled at her feet, casting anxious glances between Alice and the cats. To calm herself, Alice spoke softly about the weather, the way the blizzard was closing in, the hope that the power wouldn't go out tonight. It was habit. The way she talked to Henry, to Charlie, to the wind outside when the silence got too heavy. The sound of her voice seemed to settle the room, weaving a fragile piece from the threads of fear and awe. As the minutes ticked by, the strangeness deepened. The bobcats made no move to leave. Instead, they curled up near the fire, side by side, eyes slitted in contentment. The limping one licked its wounded leg, wincing but resolute. The larger cat, scarred, regal, its body marked by battles won and lost, watched Alice with a kind of grave approval, as if silently judging her worth. Outside, the storm thickened, wind rattling the windows, snow swirling in ghostly eddies. Inside, a new and uneasy harmony settled. Alice brewed tea, hands finally steadying as she moved around the kitchen. She found herself talking to the cats, telling them stories, recounting the history of the cabin, explaining why Henry's old chair was always kept by the window. She even found herself laughing, the sound strange and sweet in her ears. The bobcats listened, eyes never leaving her face, only sensing the tension ebb, dozed by the hearth, his snores a steady counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. But in the back of her mind, worry gnawed. Was she doing the right thing? Would the authorities see this as kindness or recklessness? What if the bobcats became aggressive, or worse, never left? What would the neighbors say if they found out she'd let wild predators into her home? She didn't have answers. All she had was this night, this impossible truce, and the silent understanding that something rare and sacred was happening. In the flickering firelight, with Charlie at her side and the wild cats dozing nearby, Alice allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to hope. As the storm howled outside and the world shrank to the warmth of the cabin, Alice knew she was standing on the edge of something new, something wild and mysterious and entirely beyond her control. And as the night deepened, she understood, deep in her bones, that she would do whatever it took to protect these unexpected guests, no matter what came next. Outside the windows, the world was pure white chaos. The blizzard screamed through the pines, battering the walls of Alice's old cabin with icy fists. Flakes spun and swirled in the lantern glow, sometimes hiding the forest altogether, then peeling back to reveal black branches and tangled shadows. The storm was the kind that shut down towns and stranded travelers, a howling beast with no patience for the weak or the unprepared. But inside, the world had shrunk to the circle of light around the fireplace, a tiny bubble of warmth and peace, fragile as spun glass. Alice moved carefully through her kitchen, the old house groaning in the wind as she prepared what food she could for her wild guests. Her nerves were raw, but her hands were steady now, surprisingly steady, as if the sheer strangeness of the situation had burned away the last of her old fears. She set out a bowl of water and some leftover chicken. What else could she offer two bobcats? Then poured herself tea, letting the steam fog her glasses. Charlie was sprawled on the rug by the hearth, one ear cocked toward the fire, the other toward the newcomers. Every so often, his tail thumped against the boards, a slow, cautious welcome. The bobcats, too, seemed to be finding their own strange peace. The smaller one, Willow, Alice had begun to think of her, slim and quick-eyed, with a faint notch in her left ear, stretched out near the embers, her injured leg tucked beneath her. Every so often she'd raise her head, golden eyes sharp, scanning the shadows, then settle again with a contented sigh. The larger male, Ranger, with his battered coat and old scars, remained more alert, his gaze tracking Alice's every movement, but his body language was no longer tense or ready to flee. For a long time, none of them spoke or moved. The only sounds were the wind howling, the fire snapping, and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of animals and woman together. But as the night deepened and the blizzard raged on, the cabin began to feel different. Alice felt it first, a loosening, a shift. She realized she was humming to herself, an old tune her mother used to sing, something about safe harbors and coming home. The song seemed to wrap itself around the room, softening the edges of fear and grief, weaving them into something warmer. The bobcats must have sensed it too. Willow crept closer, her whiskers trembling in the firelight, and nudged something toward Charlie with a paw. The field mouse from before, offered not with violence but almost with pride. Charlie, after a moment's sniff, accepted the gift with a gentle mouth and a thump of his tail, as if understanding the ritual at play. Alice watched, heart thudding with a strange mixture of delight and disbelief. She knelt on the rug, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from all three animals. "Are you trying to make friends?" she murmured, voice thick. "Or are you just hungry like the rest of us?" Willow looked at her, eyes wide and unblinking. Then, in a move so bold it made Alice's breath catch, the bobcat butted her head gently against Alice's knee, a fleeting touch before slipping away. It was an unmistakable gesture of trust, a silent thank you, or perhaps an acknowledgement of shared need. Ranger, ever the sentinel, watched his sister but didn't interfere. Instead, he limped forward. Alice could see the stiffness in his hind leg now, a wound in need of care, and dropped the rabbit near the fire, then settled with his flank just touching Willow's. He kept his eyes on Alice, but there was a softening there, a subtle change from suspicion to acceptance. In that flickering half-light, Alice saw something she hadn't allowed herself to believe for years, a house no longer echoing with loss, but pulsing quietly with new life. The ghosts of old sorrows, Henry's absence, the ache of years spent alone, all of it seemed to retreat before the undeniable presence of these wild creatures, their raw beauty and courage impossible to ignore. The blizzard intensified, shaking the windows and rattling the door. Alice moved to check the latches, and when she glanced back, Willow had curled up on Henry's old chair, something no animal had ever dared before. For a heartbeat, Alice felt a pang of pain, a tightness in her chest. But then she smiled, realizing that the chair, like the rest of the house, was meant for the living, not the dead. She returned to the fire, knelt beside Ranger, and studied his injured leg. Blood had crusted around a deep gash, likely from a trap or a thorn. The wound needed cleaning, but Alice hesitated. This was a wild animal after all, not a pet. Still, she felt a quiet urging, the same mountain sense that had guided her on the road. "It's okay," she whispered, voice soft but firm. "Let me help you." Slowly, she reached for the first aid kit, keeping her movements smooth and calm. Ranger tensed but didn't lash out. He watched as Alice dabbed a cloth with warm water, then gently wiped the blood from his fur. Willow stood watch, muscles taut, ready to defend her brother, but made no move to interfere. When Alice pressed an antiseptic pad to the wound, Ranger flinched, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in his chest, but didn't snap. Alice murmured soothing nonsense, old habits from her days with Charlie as a pup, and worked as quickly as she could. Finally, she wrapped the leg in a strip of clean cloth, tying it off with trembling fingers. "You're tougher than you look," she told him, smiling in spite of herself. Ranger looked at her, long and hard. Then, with a tired sigh, he lowered his head onto his paws and closed his eyes. Willow did the same, both cats breathing in time with the steady rhythm of the fire. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a new kind of calm had settled, a peace born of wildness, risk, and the beginnings of trust. Alice sat between her dog and the bobcats, surrounded by their warmth, and felt something inside her shift. For the first time in years, the night didn't feel empty or cold. It felt alive, and Alice knew in her bones that whatever the morning brought, Questions, consequences, or wonder, she wouldn't face it alone. When the morning finally broke, it did so gently, light seeping slowly through the frost-rimmed glass, painting the cabin in pale gold and soft blue shadows. The blizzard had stopped, leaving behind a world muted and transformed. Snow piled high against the porch, and every branch outlined in icy filigree. Alice blinked in the quiet, blinking away a confusion that felt half dream, half memory. Her first sensation was warmth. Charlie pressed against her legs, Willow curled at her hip, and Ranger at her feet. She dozed off beside the hearth, bundled in an old quilt, lulled by the fire and the measured, even breathing of her companions. It was only when Willow stretched, arching her back and letting out a chuffing yawn, that the spell broke. For a heartbeat, Alice simply watched them. Ranger's wounded leg was still wrapped in her makeshift bandage, though the cloth was stained and loose. Willow nuzzled his cheek, licking his ear with a tenderness Alice hadn't expected from a wild animal. Charlie, roused by the movement, gave a soft whine and licked Alice's hand, as if reassuring her this wasn't some wishful hallucination. Sunlight poured in, painting the floor in stripes. The hush outside was absolute, a silence so deep that Alice could hear the gentle pad of Willow's paws as she hopped down from the sofa and padded over to nose at the door. The bobcat's tail flicked, an invitation or a question, Alice wasn't sure. She got up stiffly, joints aching, and set about the morning rituals, coaxing the fire back to life, filling the kettle, checking the radio for news of the storm. Static filled the kitchen, but the weather forecast promised clear skies and deep snow. Roads blocked, power lines down, the world forced to pause. Her mind spun as she moved through the motions. What now? The bobcats had survived the night, but what was her duty? Her right, even. Could she keep them? Would they leave when the world thawed? And what would the law say if anyone found out? Before her worries could spiral, a new sound broke the quiet. A gentle tap at the porch, the crunch of footsteps in snow. Alice froze, heart pounding. No one came up this way unannounced, especially after a storm. She peered through the window and saw a familiar shape. Dr. Julian Carter, bundled in his old green parka, snow up to his knees, carrying a battered medical bag. Relief and dread mingled in Alice's chest. She opened the door just as he stepped onto the porch, breath puffing in the cold. "Morning, Alice," he said, eyebrows raised at the sight of her and the two bobcats standing calmly in the doorway. "I got your message about the hurt animal. Figured you could use some help." She let him in, nerves jangling. Charlie greeted him with a wag and a sniff. Willow and Ranger retreated to the hearth, but didn't bolt. Instead, they watched Dr. Carter with alert, measured caution, wild but not afraid. Julian knelt by the fire, letting his hands warm before he reached for Ranger. "Well, aren't you two a sight?" he murmured, more to the bobcats than to Alice. "Never thought I'd be patching up mountain cats in your living room, Alice Grant." Alice hovered nearby, biting her lip as Julian carefully unwrapped the bandage. He worked with practiced, gentle hands, examining the wound. "Deep cut, but it's clean," he said finally. "Probably a snare or wire. You did well, Alice." He reached into his bag for antiseptic and a suture kit. Alice watched, nerves prickling, as Willow pressed closer to Ranger, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Julian paused, glancing at Alice. "She's worried about her brother," he said quietly. "Talk to her. Calm her down." Alice knelt, her voice low and steady. "It's okay, Willow. He's here to help." She extended her hand, palm open, letting Willow sniff her scent. After a moment, Willow relaxed, allowing Julian to work. With practiced efficiency, Julian cleaned, stitched, and rewrapped the wound. Ranger shuddered but didn't lash out. When it was done, he leaned against Willow, eyes fluttering closed. Julian sat back on his heels, letting out a slow breath. "You've got a miracle here, Alice. It's not often wild things choose a human's company. You must have done something right." She managed a shaky laugh. "I'm not sure what. They found me." Julian's expression turned serious. "But you know, this isn't exactly legal. Wildlife laws are strict about bobcats, rehab, permits, all that. If word gets out, you could be in trouble, and they could be taken away." The words stung. Alice looked down, her heart clenching at the thought of losing Willow and Ranger just as their trust was blooming. "I can't turn them out, Julian. Not now. Not after what we've shared." He studied her, then nodded. "I believe you, and I'll help. There's a process for emergency wildlife care. Permits, documentation. It's a hassle, but it's doable, especially if the animals can't survive on their own just yet." He offered a faint smile. "I'll vouch for you, Alice. I know you'll do right by them." Relief crashed through her, leaving her shaky and light. "Thank you, Julian, truly." He set to work filling out the initial paperwork, taking photos of the bobcats, who endured it with suspicious patience, and explaining the basics of wild cat care. Diet, space, minimal stress, limited contact, to preserve their instincts. Alice listened intently, scribbling notes and asking questions, determined to do everything by the book. The day unfolded in a gentle, purposeful rhythm. Alice tended the fire, prepped simple meals, some for herself, some for her wild charges, and followed Julian's advice. Keep things calm, don't crowd them. Watch for signs of distress. Willow and Ranger moved through the cabin with a quiet confidence, sometimes curling together in the sunlight, sometimes exploring corners, always returning to the fire or to Alice's side. Charlie adapted faster than Alice expected, accepting the new order, sometimes even napping with his back pressed against Willow, their breathing in sync. For Alice, every small victory, a moment of shared calm, a soft purr from Willow, Ranger taking food from her hand, became an act of healing. The echoing loneliness of the house faded, replaced by the sound of playful steps, soft growls, and gentle companionship. That evening, after Julian left, promising to return with more supplies and updates on the permit process, Alice sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the snow-laden trees. Willow pressed close, purring softly, while Ranger sat tall and silent, his eyes scanning the horizon. Charlie lay at her feet, content. As dusk fell, Alice realized that caring for these wild creatures was healing something deep within herself, a grief too heavy to name, a longing for connection she'd buried beneath years of solitude. Now, with every act of kindness, every new moment of trust, her world grew brighter, richer, and more alive. And for the first time in years, she felt not just grateful, but truly hopeful for what tomorrow might bring. The days that followed brought a rare hush to the mountains. Snow lingered on every rooftop, and the narrow back roads remained treacherous with ice. Alice's cabin, set deep among the pines, seemed a world apart, an island of strange peace in a sea of white. But as the world slowly thawed and the old routines of town life resumed, it wasn't long before word about Alice's unusual guests began to stir. At first, it was just a few muddy tracks around her porch, deliveries that went unanswered or neighbors turning up for a check-in, surprised by the wary eyes watching from behind the curtains. But soon, stories spread as fast as the January wind. "Alice Grant's gone soft in the head," muttered old Frank at the general store, stacking cans with a weary shake of his head. "I heard she's keeping wildcats now, feeding them out of her own kitchen." "Nonsense," snapped Mrs. Pearson, hands tucked into her heavy coat as she braved the morning chill. Alice always did have a soft spot for strays. Just last spring, she bottle-fed those orphaned fawns behind her woodshed. These folks loved to talk. But talk they did. By the end of the week, the rumor had grown legs. 2 wild bobcats, not just wandering near the cabin, but living inside, sleeping by the fire, even delivering gifts to Alice and her old dog. Some folks laughed, picturing Alice serving tea to her new feline boarders. Others shivered, warning that wild animals belonged in the wild for a reason. At the center of it all, Alice tried her best to ignore the chatter. She focused on her small world, tending the fire, watching Willow's limp heel day by day, marveling at the way Ranger patrolled the porch with a quiet dignity. With Dr. Carter's help, she'd begun the permitting process, filling out forms and answering questions, sometimes lying awake at night, worrying she'd miss something vital and lose the right to keep her new friends safe. Yet, in ways she couldn't have predicted, the bobcats seemed to know they had something to prove. They took to their strange life with an odd mixture of wild grace and domestic curiosity. Willow, slinking through the snowdrifts, would leave small offerings, a mouse, a sparrow, sometimes even a bright red feather, on the porch each morning. Ranger, ever the sentinel, chased off raccoons and kept the yard clear of any creature that dared come too close, earning a grudging respect from Charlie, who joined him in barking at shadows. One frosty morning, Alice ventured into town for groceries, heart thumping with nerves. She felt every eye on her as she pushed her cart down the narrow aisles of the general store, the weight of whispers pressing at her back. "Morning, Alice," Mrs. Pearson called, forcing cheer into her voice. "Heard you've got some, unusual company out there these days." Alice smiled, her nerves hidden behind decades of mountain stoicism. "Guess word gets around. You know how it is with strays. They find me, not the other way around." Frank leaned over the counter, his suspicion barely masked. "Wild bobcats are a mite different from lost dogs, Alice. Some folks are worried. You know, safety and all that." Alice met his gaze. "They're not dangerous, Frank. They're recovering, that's all. And I've got Dr. Carter's help, just in case." He grunted, unconvinced. "Just keep it legal, Alice. Last thing we need is the sheriff up there with a tranquilizer gun." That afternoon, as if summoned by rumor, the sheriff himself showed up in a mud-spattered patrol truck, tires crunching on the frozen ruts. Sheriff Lane was a big man with a kindly face, but Alice felt her pulse leap as he stepped onto the porch. "Morning, Alice," he called, peering at the muddy prints in the snow. "Mind if I come in?" She nodded, ushering him into the warm, fire-lit cabin. Willow and Ranger retreated to the far side of the hearth, watching with narrowed eyes. Charlie sat at Alice's side, tail wagging nervously. Lane glanced around, taking in the evidence. The fur in the corners, the makeshift bedding near the fire, the way Willow and Ranger kept their distance but didn't bolt. He whistled low. "Well, I'll be. Folks weren't exaggerating." Alice squared her shoulders. "I'm not breaking the law, Lane. Dr. Carter's helping me with the permits. These animals would have died if I'd left them in the snow." Lane nodded, scratching his chin. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Alice. Just need to make sure everyone's safe. You know how it is. Some folks get spooked, file complaints. Got to check all the boxes. She handed him the paperwork, her hands only slightly shaking. Lane flipped through the forms, his expression softening. Julian Carter's signature counts for a lot. I'll let folks know you're working on it. He paused, then looked her straight in the eye. You're not alone, Alice. Not everyone thinks you're crazy, you know. Some of us figure you've always had a knack for healing lost things. His words, simple as they were, brought a sting of unexpected tears. She blinked them away, grateful for the support. As Lane left, Charlie barked once, and Willow appeared at the window, tail flicking in silent greeting. Lane smiled, lifting his hand in salute. You've got yourself quite the crew, Alice. The days that followed were tense, but not without hope. Some neighbors dropped off extra blankets or scraps for the Bobcats, leaving them on the porch without a word. Mrs. Pearson sent over a thermos of soup for the cold nights. Children peered through the trees at the edge of Alice's property, hoping for a glimpse of the legendary wildcats. Yet not everyone was charmed. A formal complaint was filed with the county, and more paperwork arrived by mail. Dr. Carter spent hours with Alice, preparing for a possible inspection, assuring her that as long as the Bobcats posed no threat and were well cared for, she stood a good chance of keeping them, at least until they were ready to return to the wild. Alice steeled herself for whatever came next. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with Charlie, Willow, and Ranger, feeling the eyes of the world pressing at the edges of her home, but refusing to let fear in. Every time the Bobcats curled at her feet or left a gift on the porch, she knew she was doing something that mattered, not just for them, but for herself, and maybe even for the whole wary, wondering town. For the first time in a long while, Alice felt both fiercely protective and quietly proud. Against the odds, she was building something new, one act of trust at a time. Winter seemed to stall in the mountains, refusing to loosen its grip. Snow clung stubbornly to the shaded gullies, and cold crept in at the corners of Alice's cabin, reminding her that nothing stayed easy for long. The routines she'd built, caring for Willow and Ranger, sharing sunlit afternoons with Charlie, felt suddenly precarious, threatened by the shadow of bureaucracy and the judgment of outsiders. The first real blow came in a plain white envelope, slipped into her battered mailbox beneath a flurry of flyers and local advertisements. Alice knew the weight of bad news before she even opened it. The envelope was thick, official, with the county seal pressed into the corner. Charlie barked anxiously as she tore it open, hands stiff with worry. Inside, the letter was blunt. Notification of review. Unauthorized wildlife care. Reported presence of 2 bobcats on your property has triggered an investigation. Please prepare to comply with all county and state wildlife ordinances. Alice sat at her old kitchen table, staring at the words until they blurred. The dread that had hovered at the edge of her thoughts all these weeks now took shape. Cold, heavy, inescapable. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her hands, to remember the sound of Willow's purr and Ranger's cautious, watchful steps. She called Dr. Carter, voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming, Julian. They might take them away." His answer was firm, unwavering. "We'll fight it, Alice. I'll come by tonight. We'll prepare everything together. Don't give up." The waiting was its own kind of torture. That afternoon, Alice moved through the cabin like a ghost, scrubbing and tidying, gathering every scrap of documentation. Daily logs, photos, notes on their diet and behavior, vet receipts. She printed out emails from Dr. Carter and made a binder of the legal paperwork in progress. Still, the worry gnawed at her. Would any of it be enough? Word of the investigation spread quickly. By nightfall, the phone rang with calls from neighbors. Mrs. Pearson's voice shook with concern. Alice, if there's anything I can do, you let me know. You're not alone, dear. Old Frank grumbled that the county had better things to do than harassing good folks who mind their own business. A few calls were less friendly, veiled warnings about public safety, anxious reminders that wild animals belonged nowhere near children or pets. But support grew too. Dr. Carter drove up through the falling dusk, bringing extra medical supplies and a plan. We'll show them you've done everything right. Willow and Ranger are healthier than when you found them. You have every right to temporary care, especially with my backing. He rehearsed the details with Alice, talking her through every likely question. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Show them you care for these animals with respect and responsibility. The next morning dawned gray and cold. The county officials arrived promptly, their truck gleaming in the drive. Alice watched from the window, heart pounding, as two officers, one in a brown uniform, the other in a green wildlife jacket, stepped out, clipboards in hand. Dr. Carter greeted them at the door, his manner courteous but unyielding. The inspection felt endless. The officials photographed the house, the yard, and the animals. They quizzed Alice about every aspect of care: diet, vaccination, handling. Ranger and Willow kept their distance, curious but not aggressive, shadowing Alice's movements and sometimes sitting by Charlie, as if they too understood they were being judged. At one point, an officer asked, "Aren't you worried about the risk, Ms. Grant? These are wild predators." Alice looked him in the eye, voice steady. "I respect that, but they've never shown aggression. They trust me because I've earned it. They're not pets. They're recovering. If I hadn't intervened, they would have died in the storm." Dr. Carter spoke up, describing the wounds he'd treated, the progress both Bobcats had made. "Alice has acted under my guidance at every step. She's followed every recommendation. Removing them now could be more dangerous, for the animals and for the community." The officers made notes, faces unreadable. As they wrapped up, one of them softened. "We'll review the paperwork and speak with the state. In the meantime, the animals must remain on the property under your supervision. No visitors, no publicity until the review is complete." Alice nodded, feeling both relief and anxiety. It wasn't a win, not yet, but it wasn't a loss either. The following days were taut with suspense. Willow and Ranger seemed to sense the change. They grew more alert, sometimes disappearing for hours to prowl the edge of the woods, but always returning at dusk, brushing past Alice's legs as if drawing comfort from her presence. The cabin felt both full and fragile, every footstep an echo of hope or fear. Neighbors continued to visit, some bringing supplies, others simply sitting with Alice on the porch, talking about everything but the case. Charlie seemed to take on the role of ambassador, trotting between guests and Bobcats, breaking tension with a wag of his tail. One afternoon, a knock at the door startled Alice from her worries. Sheriff Lane stood on the porch, hat in hand. "Heard the county's been giving you a hard time, Alice. Thought you might want a friendly face around." They drank coffee in the kitchen, the sheriff's steady presence a balm. "I'll testify for you, if it comes to that," he offered quietly. "Lot of folks around here remember how you took in strays, fixed up lost dogs. That counts for something, no matter what the paperwork says." Alice thanked him, the weight in her chest easing a little. For all the fear and uncertainty, she realized, she wasn't facing it alone. That night, As she sat by the fire with Charlie, Willow, and Ranger close by, Alice let herself believe, just a little, in the goodness of her community, and in her own right to fight for what mattered. Whatever happened, she was resolved to stand her ground, not just for herself, but for the wild lives that had come to depend on her. And as the wind rose outside and the darkness pressed close, Alice understood something new. Sometimes, the fiercest guardianship is simply refusing to give up, no matter who or what comes knocking at your door. By the time spring crept across the mountains, even the oldest snowdrifts surrendered to the sun. Meltwater sang in the creeks, and the air, once sharp with frost, was now thick with the smell of new grass and pine needles. Where winter's hush had ruled, the land now buzzed with birdsong and the eager, trembling pulse of life. Alice felt it first in the garden, the way the earth yielded beneath her hands, the promise of green shooting up from last year's brown. But she felt it most inside the cabin. Where once her home had echoed with emptiness, now laughter and movement filled every corner. It wasn't just the animals, though Willow's playful antics and Ranger's quiet patrols brought their own music. It was the people who, slowly, hesitantly, began to return. When the provisional permit came through, a slim envelope stamped and official, Alice read it with trembling hands. Temporary wildlife rehabilitation site. Strict supervision required. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was something precious. Permission to care, to belong, to hope out loud. Dr. Carter was the first to congratulate her. "You did it, Alice," he said, giving her a rare, crooked grin. "Now let's make sure the whole town gets a chance to understand what you've been building here." So, with the snow gone and the world waking up, Alice invited her neighbors for coffee on the porch. At first, only Mrs. Pearson came, clutching a tin of lemon bars and eyeing the garden for signs of Bobcat mischief. But word spread, and soon others followed. Families, children, even old Frank, who claimed he just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Willow and Ranger adapted in their own way. Willow, her limp nearly gone, became the official greeter, appearing on the porch with a sly chirp, and more often than not, a gift at her feet. A mouse, a ribbon of shed snakeskin, once even a shiny bottle cap. She'd drop her prize at a visitor's shoes, then sit, tail flicking, waiting for a reaction. The children squealed with delight. Adults watched in awe, some still wary but most enchanted. Ranger, always the sentinel, kept to the edges at first. He watched the gatherings from the shade, eyes calm and unreadable, his presence steady as the mountains themselves. But as the days passed, he too began to inch closer. Once, when a neighbor's toddler toddled too close to the woodpile, Ranger inserted himself between the child and the dark, tail lashing, ears forward. The mother gasped, but Dr. Carter explained, "He's not hunting, he's protecting. That's what they do." With Dr. Carter's help, Alice began turning her porch gatherings into impromptu lessons. She showed her neighbors how to read animal tracks, how to tell a bobcat's call from a coyote's, how to respect wild creatures without fearing them. Children took notes in battered notebooks, and adults found themselves drawn in by stories of rescue and survival, of how Willow and Ranger had become not just residents, but gentle guardians of the cabin. Some guests brought their own stories, tales of foxes in the henhouse, lost dogs returned, even the occasional bear sighting. Alice listened, learning in return, her circle of friends growing wider with every visit. Inside, the cabin itself seemed to bloom. Where there had once been silence, now there was noise. Clattering mugs, the slap of cards on the kitchen table, the shrieks of children playing hide and seek among the shadows. Willow and Ranger adapted with a patience Alice found astonishing. Willow let herself be admired, though she never allowed a hand to touch her without invitation. Ranger, regal and reserved, occasionally bestowed a slow blink of approval. Charlie, for his part, relished his new role as mediator. He would shepherd children away from Willow's favorite napping spot or break up minor scuffles over toys, his tail wagging constantly. He became famous for his tolerance and his gentle discipline, an old dog learning new tricks. Of course, not all visits went smoothly. One afternoon, a neighbor's dog got loose, bursting through the open gate and charging straight for the Bobcats. Ranger stood his ground, hackles up, while Willow darted for cover. The children screamed, and Alice's heart nearly stopped. But Ranger didn't attack. He simply planted himself between the intruder and Willow, making himself an unmovable wall. Dr. Carter intervened, leashing the frantic dog and calming everyone down. "That's not violence, folks," he said, voice firm. "That's protection. That's what happens when you build trust." Word of these encounters spread. Some folks who had doubted before came to see for themselves. Others sent letters or called with questions. The county wildlife office even sent an inspector, this time more curious than confrontational. She took notes, watched as Willow gifted a feather to a shy child, and smiled. "You're not just rehabilitating animals, Ms. Grant," she said quietly. "You're rehabilitating trust, in nature, in each other." By late spring, Alice's home had become a kind of sanctuary. People came not just for the Bobcats, but for the sense of welcome, the hope that bloomed in every corner. Old wounds between neighbors, between humans and wildness, seemed to heal in the simple acts of watching, learning, and caring. One Saturday, the porch overflowed with guests for a community picnic. Children traced tracks in the mud, parents swapped recipes, and the fire crackled in the gathering dusk. Willow, bold as ever, leapt onto the porch rail, her eyes shining with reflected lantern light. Ranger sat beside Alice's chair, regal and at ease. Charlie snored at her feet. In that moment, surrounded by laughter, stories, and the wild hearts she had come to love, Alice felt a surge of pride and belonging deeper than any she'd known. The grief that had shadowed her life for so long seemed smaller now, still present, still part of her, but no longer the whole story. Her house was alive, and so was she. The days grew longer as summer pressed itself fully into the valley, painting the mountains in a riot of green and wildflowers. The sunlit afternoons brought a hush to the woods, broken only by the trills of birds or the low rustle of wind through the pines. For the first time in many years, Alice found herself craving the quiet, not as a shield against grief, but as a space to listen and to notice. It was on these tranquil afternoons, with Willow purring in her lap and Ranger lying nearby, that Alice found herself reflecting on everything she'd come to understand since that fateful winter night. The Bobcats had arrived as a wild, shivering disruption, but what they brought with them was more than chaos or trouble. They brought new meaning, a lesson woven through every gesture, every gift, every wary glance and sudden purr. She thought first about trust, the way it is earned in small increments, never demanded or assumed. Willow had taught her this with every cautious step closer, every nervous glance that slowly, over months, transformed into bold curiosity. Even now, with the world around them changed and the cabin a haven of noise and life, Willow chose when to come close, when to press her body against Alice's side, when to vanish into the brush. There was no forcing trust, Alice had learned. It must be invited, and even then it might be refused, or offered only in moments as fleeting as a bobcat's shadow in moonlight. Ranger, for his part, had been the teacher of boundaries. His quiet watchfulness reminded Alice that protection could be fierce but gentle, that being present for another, animal or human, often meant standing guard without smothering, letting the wildness in them remain unbroken. He greeted visitors with wary tolerance, always alert for signs of danger, yet never crossing the line into aggression. When he chose to approach, it was always on his own terms, his trust a precious and hard-won thing. On one dusky evening, Alice sat on the porch with a mug of chamomile tea, Willow curled at her feet. Ranger kept watch at the edge of the yard, his profile outlined against the glowing sky. The day had been full. A group of local school children had visited to learn about wildlife, their excited voices still echoing in Alice's mind. Willow had surprised everyone by presenting a shiny pebble to one of the shyest children, who cradled it as if it were a jewel. The girl's mother had wept softly, later telling Alice that her daughter rarely spoke, yet had whispered, "She likes me," over and over, her eyes wide with wonder. Alice watched as Ranger disappeared into the tall grass, silent as a memory. She thought of all the ways the bobcats had become not just wild residents, but teachers to everyone who came near. Their gifts, sometimes strange, sometimes messy, were reminders of how love and care could look different from what one expected. A mouse or a feather at the door, a gentle headbutt, a soft trill at dusk. These were not grand gestures, but small acts of connection, honest and unfiltered. Acceptance, Alice realized, was the core of it all. Accepting the wildness in others, the unpredictability of change, the possibility that healing could come from the most unexpected places. She'd spent years walling off her grief, convinced that love required order and safety, that connection could only thrive within familiar boundaries. But Willow and Ranger had upended all that, teaching her that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply to make room for the unknown, to sit quietly beside fear or sorrow, to offer care with no guarantee of it being returned. That lesson echoed in the community, too. Neighbors who once looked at Alice's cabin with suspicion now came seeking advice about wildlife, or asking to hear the story again of how the bobcats had survived that first storm. Parents spoke of how their children were less afraid of the woods now, more curious about the tracks they found in the mud, more willing to see animals as neighbors instead of threats. Dr. Carter often remarked that Alice's home had become a bridge, a place where the boundary between wild and tame, human and animal, was less a line and more a meeting ground. One afternoon, as a summer storm brewed on the horizon, Alice stood with her hand on Willow's head, feeling the steady rumble of purring. "You taught me more than I ever expected," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not just about bobcats or wilderness, but about letting go, about letting things come and go as they must, about finding love in the spaces I didn't even know were empty." Ranger, hearing her voice, patted over and pressed his shoulder against her leg, eyes soft with understanding. For a moment, Alice felt the weight of the past, the long years of loss and solitude slip away, replaced by gratitude for these wild gifts, for the new meaning her life had found. That evening, the three of them, Alice, Willow, and Ranger, sat on the porch as the rain pattered against the roof and the world faded into the blue-gray hush of twilight. Willow blinked slow and content. Ranger watched the distant trees, and Alice closed her eyes, breathing in the peace of their shared silence. She knew now that the bobcats hadn't just brought her company or excitement. They had transformed her sense of home and belonging. They'd shown her that real connection was possible even across differences, that the bravest thing she could do was open her heart to the unknown and accept love however it was offered. Messy, wild, and beautiful. And as the storm passed and the last rays of sun broke through the clouds, Alice understood the deepest lesson of all. Kindness and curiosity, more than fear or caution, could change the world. One small, wild gift at a time, summer ripened and mellowed into late August. The mountains, lush and full, seemed to breathe with each changing breeze. Around Alice's cabin, the days moved with a lazy, golden rhythm, every afternoon thick with the hum of bees and the scent of pine sap and warm earth. The memories of winter's hardships had faded, but Alice often caught herself thinking back, tracing each step of this unlikely journey, wondering at how her heart had shifted in ways she could never have planned. The community day had begun as a simple idea, a way to say thank you, to give something back after all the support and curiosity her neighbors had shown. Dr. Carter and Mrs. Pearson helped her organize it, spreading word at the general store, on porch steps, and even through handwritten invitations tucked into mailboxes. By mid-morning, families had started arriving with baskets of food, jars of lemonade, and homemade pies. Kids swarmed the garden, their laughter ringing through the clear air as they pointed out animal tracks and tried to spot Willow and Ranger. Alice stood on her porch, watching the swirl of activity. Her heart was full, but a gentle ache pulsed beneath her ribs, a mix of joy, gratitude, and the bittersweet knowledge that nothing ever truly stays the same. As parents set out blankets and children tumbled down the grassy slope, she realized she wasn't just hosting a party. She was sharing a story, a home, and the wild, fragile bonds she'd built. Willow appeared first, slipping through the tall grass with that familiar, liquid grace. The children squealed in delight, and Willow paused at the edge of the crowd, yellow eyes curious and unafraid. One of the braver kids, little Mia from the next valley, crouched low, holding out a small stone. Willow patted over, sniffed the offering, and blinked slowly in approval before nudging Mia's hand with her head. Ranger watched from the shadows of the woodpile, regal as ever, his calm gaze never leaving Willow's side. Alice gathered the children on the porch for a lesson in respect, how to greet a wild animal with patience, how to give space and never chase or corner. She showed them the scratch marks in the trees where the bobcats stretched, the trails they left in the mud, the way their gifts appeared each morning on the porch. Wild things give us clues, she told them, if only we learn to listen. As the afternoon wore on, adults gathered around the picnic tables to share stories, some about animals, some about their own lives. Old Frank recounted the time a lost fawn followed him all the way home. Mrs. Pearson confessed her first reaction to Alice's wild guests had been fear, but watching you care for them, Alice, reminded me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about choosing what matters most, even when you are. When the topic of the legal battle came up, Alice didn't shy away. She told the story of the complaint, the officials, and her own sleepless nights filled with worry that Willow and Ranger would be taken away. She explained how Dr. Carter and Sheriff Lane had stood by her, and how neighbors had brought food, blankets, and silent support during the worst of the uncertainty. The hardest part, Alice admitted, was knowing that fighting for what's right isn't always comfortable or easy. Sometimes you have to stand alone for a while. But I wasn't really alone. Not with so many of you rooting for me or helping however you could. That's what got us through. She glanced at Willow, who was now stretched out on the porch rail, blinking contentedly in the sun, and Ranger, who had edged closer to the group, watching the children with quiet tolerance. The conversation turned to letting go, how sometimes the ones you love need to move on, and sometimes they stay for reasons you can't explain. Alice told the children that one day, Willow and Ranger might return fully to the wild, and that would be a good thing, not a loss. Love means letting things be free, she said, her voice soft, and trusting that the bond you built will last, even after goodbyes. The parents listened, some nodding with tears in their eyes, others holding their children close. The sun sank lower, gold pouring through the pines and making everything glow. Later, as the gathering wound down, Alice found herself walking the trails behind her cabin with a small group of kids. They stopped at a clearing where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. She crouched down and showed them how to recognize fox tracks from those of bobcats, how to tell which berries were safe to eat, and how to be gentle with every living thing. As dusk crept in, she gathered everyone back at the porch for a final story. She spoke about how the wild had healed her, slowly and quietly, teaching her that home wasn't just four walls or familiar faces. It was the courage to open your door, to take risks, to welcome the unknown. When you care for something wild, you have to accept the mystery, she said, looking at each of the children in turn. That's where all the best stories begin. Dr. Carter closed the evening by thanking Alice for her bravery. "You taught us all something, Alice," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You showed us that sometimes it takes just one person willing to open their heart and their home, no matter how much trouble it brings, to help a whole community remember what kindness really means." As the stars brightened overhead and families drifted home, Alice stood on her porch, Willow and Ranger beside her and Charlie's head resting against her knee. She felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging so deep it made her breath catch. And as the last lanterns flickered out and the world settled into peaceful silence, Alice knew this was her story's greatest lesson, that by opening herself to the wild, she had found her place, not just in her cabin, but in a community of hearts, wild and human alike, forever changed by the courage to care. Under the wide sweep of the summer night, Alice sat on her porch, the world hushed around her. Above, stars scattered across the black sky in dazzling silence, and the pine trees stood sentinel, their silhouettes painted in silver by the rising moon. Charlie lay at her feet, breath slow and steady, while Willow dozed nearby, tail curled tight, and Ranger kept his usual watch at the edge of the porch, eyes glowing amber in the half-light. It was a quiet moment, a gentle pause at the end of a season marked by change and challenge. The last echoes of laughter from the day's gathering had faded, replaced by the soothing chorus of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Alice breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the cool, resin-scented air, and let herself feel the weight and the lightness of everything she had been through. She glanced at Willow and Ranger, these two wild hearts who had chosen her, who had turned her solitary cabin into a living, breathing home. Their presence was no longer a disruption or an emergency, but a steady part of her days, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected arrivals are the ones that shape us most. Alice reached for her old notebook, the pages soft and worn. She had begun writing again in the spring, capturing small memories, thoughts, and lessons in crooked handwriting. She found herself reflecting on the gifts she had received, not the field mice and feathers, but the gifts of trust, courage, and belonging. She thought of her first winter alone after Henry died, how the silence had felt endless and heavy. Back then, she'd believed her story was winding down, her heart too battered to open again. Now, as she looked at the sleeping bobcats, the dog curled at her feet, and the gentle shadows that danced in the moonlight, she knew that was never true. Life, she'd learned, was full of wild gifts, some painful, some wondrous, all invitations to begin again. With the community day behind her, Alice noticed more and more people coming by the cabin, not always to see the bobcats, but sometimes just to share a story, to ask for advice about a wild animal in their yard, or to bring news from town. She welcomed them with a smile, a mug of tea, or an offer to walk the trails. She realized her own healing had become part of something larger, a ripple spreading through the valley, touching others in ways she could never have foreseen. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Dr. Carter and Mrs. Pearson, Alice listened as her friends swapped stories about their own brushes with the wild. A bear's tracks in the garden, a fox caught stealing eggs, a family of wrens nesting under the eaves. Each story was a small, shimmering thread in the tapestry of their lives, binding them to the land and to each other. If this story touched you, Alice wrote later that night, I'd love to hear about your own wild encounters or the unexpected gifts you've received from nature or your community. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if these stories bring you joy, consider liking or subscribing to join our growing circle of wild-hearted friends. She smiled at the words, imagining someone far away reading them and feeling less alone, more open to the small wonders waiting outside their own door. Maybe her story could be an invitation, a way to remind others that life still had magic, even in its quietest moments. As the summer deepened, Willow and Ranger remained, but Alice sensed the subtle restlessness growing in them. Sometimes Willow would vanish for hours into the woods, returning with new scents and the gleam of adventure in her eyes. Ranger would sit at the tree line at dawn, muscles taut, as if listening for a call only he could hear. Alice knew that the day might come when they would choose the wild over her hearth, and while the thought brought a twist of sadness, it also filled her with pride. She had kept her promise, to care, to protect, and to let go all at once. On her final evening before the first hint of autumn, Alice gathered her friends, both animal and human, on the porch beneath a sky just beginning to turn gold with the setting sun. They sat together in easy silence, watching fireflies flicker in the tall grass and listening to the soft sounds of the world winding down. It was a moment she wished she could hold forever, and yet she knew the beauty of it lay in its fleetingness. Alice raised her mug in a quiet toast. To Willow and Ranger, who showed me that even the wildest lives can bring us closer, to each other, to healing, and to wonder, one small gift at a time. Her friends echoed her, their voices low and heartfelt. And as night fell, Alice felt a peace she had not known in years settle over her. She was not alone. She was part of something larger, a community drawn together by courage, kindness, and the wild hearts who had found their way to her door. As the last light faded, Alice whispered her gratitude into the darkness. She invited anyone listening, anywhere, to share their own wild stories, to reach out and join the ever-growing circle of those who believed in second chances and small miracles. The wild gifts of Willow and Ranger would stay with her always, not just in memory, but in every act of openness, every risk taken, every hand extended to the unknown. And as the stars blinked overhead and the forest rustled with possibility, Alice understood. Her story was never just hers alone. It belonged to everyone who dared to welcome the wild, To everyone who learned to see each new day as an invitation, and to everyone brave enough to answer with love.